tell you what the panel's about. And actually, before I do that, Bud Weinstein and Nicholas Saliba have done this terrific book, which I mentioned earlier, but I hope all of you have a chance to get a copy outside. The Energy Log Jam, Removing Regulatory Obstacles to Fuel the Economy, Vital Statistics on America's Most Promising Sector. And this is actually somewhat similar to the book some of you have already seen that we produced for immigration that Matt Denhart did. So a lot of interesting charts and really talks about the regulatory logjam. So like states, nations too have different, interesting that everybody's sitting back there rather than up here. This is where the Security Council is. You guys are all just in the General Assembly, so you can come down here if you want, but you don't have to. So like states, nations too have different experiences when it comes to energy. Some nations see their energy sectors growing faster than others, and the available natural resources are just one contributing factor, which is a theme that, that we've been developing all day. It's not just the natural resources, it is the policies that count. So countries' regulatory policies toward energy can make a big difference between stagnation and unemployment on the one hand and ferocious growth on the other hand. This panel brings together policymakers and industry leaders to discuss how policies abroad impact growth and outline the lessons that can be applied here at home. And the panel will be introduced by my longtime good friend, Jim Lucier. Jim is Managing Director of Capital Alpha Partners, where he leads the energy and environmental practice. And I think many of you remember that before co-founding Capital Alpha Partners, which was 6 years ago, Jim was a senior vice president at Prudential Equity Group, where for 9 years he was a member of Prudential's well-known Washington Strategy Group. He really built one of the first really terrific Washington strategy groups that any large financial firm had. Anyway, I'm going to turn everything over to the very able Jim Lucier and welcome the panel to the stage.
Well, thanks very much, Jim, for that very kind introduction. And I'd certainly like to thank the Bush Institute for welcoming us to this terrific facility. It's just so beautiful. I especially enjoy being in a building that is so bright, shiny, and new. And of course, the terrific catering has helped too. So a big thanks to the Bush Center, to President Bush and his staff. This panel has got a very simple theme. I can really state it in one sentence, and that is that energy is the driver that will get us to 4% growth. Really, if we don't get the energy part of the equation right, nothing else matters. I've got 4 major points I'd like to throw out just to sort of highlight the path for our discussions. I want to talk a little bit about the US versus Europe. I want to build on that point I made earlier, that if we don't do energy right, nothing else matters. I want to point out that we're a fragile energy superpower, and all this talk about how much energy we have ignores some of the real roadblocks we have to producing energy. Self-inflicted, self-imposed roadblocks. And then finally, as a catch-all topic, because it's so expansive, we do a lot of dumb things in this country. And definitely, we do many things well, but there are plenty of dumb things which we'll analyze in this seminar session. Quickly about the US and Europe. Whenever I'm in Europe, I love to quote a line that's purportedly from Otto von Bismarck, that God has a special providence for drunkards, fools, and the United States of America. And we Americans like to think of ourselves as exceptional, as different, as somehow more vital than Europe. But the reality is that our macroeconomic statistics look more European all the time in terms of exploding debt, deficits. Actually, the Europeans put us to shame, at least in the northern tier, with regard to fiscal discipline, our aging workforce, and of course our slowing 2% growth rate, well below the post-World War II trend. The one ace in the hole, our get-out-of-jail-free card, if you will, is the fact that we are the world's #1 energy superpower, that we do probably have more hydrocarbon resources than any other country on the planet. Certainly the North American continent has more hydrocarbons and probably also more other forms of energy. So we've got to take advantage of that. With regard to energy being the critical thing, we shouldn't just think about energy security as being supply security or national security. It's really economic security too. Energy development in the U.S., to the extent that we do become energy independent, it means we're not borrowing money from the Chinese to buy oil from the Saudis anymore, at least to that extent. So energy production is key for tax revenue, for employment, for economic growth generally, but also for our fiscal indicators, the debt deficit, interest rates, the strength of the dollar. It's also a big competitive advantage. Energy in the United States costs much less than our major economic competitors. Electricity and natural gas are both 3 to 4 times expensive in Europe and Japan as they are in the United States. And when you make stuff, paying 3x or 4x for electricity makes a very, very big difference. We also happen to have the world's largest gas supply, cheap gas, natural gas liquids, next to the world's largest industrial complex that can actually use them. That's a fundamental strategic advantage that we can't give up. The fragile part of the superpower business is that our resources are not the same as those of Saudi Arabia in one big way. We drill about 10,000 wells a year. Those wells have hyperbolic decline rates. The minute the drilling stops, the minute the production activity stops, the oil story stops too. So it's not as if we've discovered limitless oil. It's oil we need to keep working on all the time, and that's where regulation can be a big barrier. We also need to keep building the infrastructure, the pipelines, the processing plants, the power plants, even the electric transmission lines have become a critical roadblock in developing our energy economy. And finally, with regard to things the U.S. could do better, I could point to our energy permitting system. Canada's got a much more rational National Energy Board system. One could argue that our EPA regulations are running amok. We have punitive taxes on many capital-intensive industries. Climate regulations certainly will put a chokehold on hydrocarbon development over time. And there are many, many other topics we'll get to. Perhaps even Brezhnev-era socialism, which is our basic policy for running public lands. So that's my quick overview, but what I'd like to do is start with Professor Roger Miners from UT Arlington here. Professor, you're an expert on regulation, the cost and benefits of regulation. What do we need to understand about regulatory creep in the U.S.? What kind of costs and benefits does that have?
Well, as the previous panel was discussing, we've got this rapid ratcheting up of major regulations that are going to have a significant impact on the future of electricity prices in particular in this country. The agencies are able to justify the actions they want to take because they are following the existing law concerning cost-benefit analysis. All they have to do is show that if it's over a $100 million project, the impact, which almost everything is, that the benefits are greater than the cost. Well, they've rigged the game now by assigning a price to carbon emissions. That's something that is not priced. There is no market for it, so they just invent the price. And by doing so, they're able to show that the benefits of every one of these regulations that were being discussed earlier, such as the mercury regulation, have a benefit that is many times higher than the multi-billion-dollar cost they acknowledge will be imposed, because they talk about in the cost benefit, we will destroy jobs, we will push up the price of products. But this will be offset because there will be less carbon in the atmosphere, and we value carbon at $34 a ton. It doesn't matter. Pick a number, because they can pick any number they want. So the whole cost-benefit analysis has become very bogus compared to the way before there was an attempt to be relatively honest in it. They admit freely that we can set the prices, so therefore any regulation we propose will show a net benefit. It's why Keystone fails the test. Yes, industry is willing to build it, but that doesn't matter because it will deliver oil, which carries carbon. Carbon will end up in the atmosphere, and therefore it fails the cost-benefit analysis test. So we're preventing ourselves from exploiting our comparative advantage.
So is there a way to fix this, having more transparency in these estimates, or revisiting something like Chevron deference, whereby the executive agencies get to do pretty much whatever they want in terms of...
They do have a lot of discretion as to what they do, because most of these regulations are challenged, but the courts are deferential to the agencies for the decisions they make. It's all published. This stuff isn't secret. They promote their results, and they're very proud of them.
Well, I'd like to switch over to another great regulatory scholar and someone who's actually much more than that. Boyden was counsel to the president in the Bush 41 administration for President George H.W. Bush, really one of the principal legal policymakers, an expert in the Clean Air Act, and of course an expert in transportation. He was also, like my good friend Ambassador Bill Middendorf, the U.S. ambassador to the European Union. So, Ambassador Gray, what advantages do we have with regard to Europe in terms of natural gas production?
The principal advantage that we have over Europe and every other country, basically, is that our property rights regime gives ownership of the minerals under the land to the landowner, which means that the landowner will be incentivized, is incentivized to let, big trucks go rambling around and a lot of dust being kicked up as these fracking wells are drilled. It doesn't last forever, but it does last long enough to be disruptive. In Europe, since the landowner doesn't get any automatic benefit, the landowner, and more densely populated, is not quite so friendly to having this resource developed. But we're very lucky. We also have legal regimes which are better than what Europe has. We're way ahead in terms of the technology because it was invented here, mostly here in this state. I would say that, say, China, which is gobbling up every international oil asset they can get, they're probably 10 years behind us. I'm told that they have probably 4 times the shale capacity, but the shale is deeper. It's located in places where it's hard to get water. They don't have the legal infrastructure. They're experimenting with CO2 as a fracking medium, which is apparently also a very positive opportunity here in this country. It would solve a lot of environmental problems if we could do that, getting rid of CO2 in the bargain. But we have those advantages, and I want to say a word about Russia since it's a little bit topical now, and sort of this is part of the next panel that Jim Glassman will chair. But we have the opportunity, and with allies, to export and really knock the wind out of Putin's sails. I mean, the thing that he is terrified of is fracking, and he has bought anti-fracking laws in Bulgaria and other Eastern European countries. He has tried to scare people. He hates the fracking possibility because it challenges his monopoly. And the best weapon we have, I believe, against Russia is against the Russian Red Army, which today is not their military, which is highly incompetent, but Gazprom. That's what people in Europe refer to as the Red Army. And so we have an opportunity to really knock the wind out of their sails, and now's a good time to start saber rattling, I think, about that. So that's the advantage that we have. I'd say there's a slight disadvantage, and I'll get into this if you want.
No, we want to hear about the positive and the negative. I mean, the supply side, which you've outlined, we've got property rights, we've got a legal regime, we've got the capital markets, we've got the technology, we've got the supply chain, we've got the skilled force, we've got the infrastructure. All of these things are great. But on the other hand, why aren't we using more natural gas in transportation? I mean, that would seem to be a big, big application where there's very little traction in the U.S.
I think there's more friendliness to this in Europe, more openness in China. They're experimenting with methanol, which is a byproduct of natural gas. We are very slow to introduce competition into the fuel markets. It's a virtual monopoly for gasoline for light-duty trucks and diesel for heavy-duty. And the heavy-duty truck market is 20% of our oil usage, and the light-duty centrally fueled, where you could do compressed gas without having to worry about reaching every consumer and their ability to refuel on the road, but centrally fueled fleets, delivery vans, whatnot. Now that's a major, they drive about twice as much as ordinary passenger car. There is no competition. EPA, and I could go into some detail, but it's really nerdy. But the regulatory regime is unbelievably pervasive and impenetrable. But the bottom line is it raises barriers to entry for competition and makes it very difficult for natural gas. The only segment that EPA kind of looks fondly upon or nicely upon is electricity. But the other possibilities, especially for natural gas, are, and I'll give you one little example. The incentives in the statutes for CAFE, corporate average fuel economy, which were renewed in a sense by Bush 43, but go back to Ford, provided for incentives for domestically produced energy. And they provide certain calculations, and a natural gas car is counted in your fleet average as a car that can go 200 miles per gallon. Now, it doesn't take too many 200 mile per gallon cars to see how much flexibility it gives the car company in meeting these very, very strict standards that actually derive out of the 2007 Bush 43 statute. But what EPA did under the Clean Air Act, which was under provisions that acted long before anyone knew what global warming was, is that they have actually canceled, they repeal, EPA repeals Congress's incentives for alternatively fueled vehicles. Now, where does EPA get the authority to repeal a Bush 43 statute? That's a very good question for lawyers, and I'm a lawyer, and I could go into the details about that too, but then the audience, you would not hear from anybody else. But it's a very curious thing. One of the things that Obama did was use the power of the power of incumbency to blackmail the car companies. I won't bore you with the details of how they did that, but they basically got the car companies to agree not to challenge anything that he did in this realm. So the car companies cannot sue to challenge the fact that they've been utterly disadvantaged. And I wish there were some car companies here to defend themselves. There aren't. But at the last Bush conference, first Bush conference, which was at SMU before this building was built, there was a lot of attention paid to this. I think it deserves a lot of attention, and I will just stop there.
Well, that's terrific. At this point, I'd like to make an introduction in absentia. Congressman Kevin Brady is not here. He did send a statement, which I think by unanimous consent we'll insert in the record. But I want to make two big points. First is that he is one of the principal sponsors of legislation that would actually direct the United States government to start looking for oil offshore. You know, imagine that if we have oil resources off the East Coast, perhaps we should actually look for them. We've not done any looking since 1981, even though we do know that we have enormous formations off the East Coast, such as the Carolina Trough, for instance, was actually leased out at one point in the 80s. Mr. Brady has also been a principled exponent of efficient tax for oil and gas, and this may be something we bring up in a few minutes when we talk to the business contingent on our panel about how oil and gas is an industry where the capital investment is so enormous that it really does require exterior sources of capital, but also efficient tax policy to get tax deductions returned to investors quickly. But I want to turn to Mexico. Duncan, you lived in Mexico for 17 years as a professor. You've now moved to the Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholars, which is really one of the premier institutions in Washington. It's not a think tank so much as a collection of people who do a lot of thinking about places where they've been. And you've had a chance to see some pretty significant changes in Mexico politically. At the same time, our friends in Mexico are looking across the border. They're looking up north. They're wondering what they could learn. They'd love to see some of this technology come down there. What's the big thing going on with Mexican oil and gas right now, Duncan?
Thank you, Jim. It's great to be here, by the way, and I'm happy to say I'm not the only sort of Mexico person, that Jordi will be here later on this afternoon to talk about the Mexican experience as well. But, you know, what's been interesting so far, I think, today has been to hear the conversation about all the things that the United States is probably doing wrong. But if you really want to see an example of how not to run your energy system, look south of the border, at least until now. I mean, between 1938 and today, we've had essentially a closed oil and gas sector in Mexico, minimal private and foreign participation, a national monopoly in oil and gas production, Pemex, a national monopoly on electricity production, the Federal Electricity Commission. But we're on the verge of something really, really exciting in Mexico right now. And that's why it merits attention, I would say. There is legislation that is being debated in the Mexican Congress right now based upon a presidential initiative from Enrique Peña Nieto, the president of Mexico, that would essentially change the two most important articles of the Mexican Constitution relating to energy. That is Article 27 and Article 28 of the Mexican Constitution. And changing these two articles will mean that for the first time since 1960, it will be legally possible for private companies to go into Mexico, to exploit the oil and then to receive a share of the profits. Up until this point, they've been able to go in, sign a contract with Pemex, and received a fixed fee per barrel for the oil that comes out, and that's generally a very, very low fee. So it tends to be services companies that go in there. Now we're looking at the possibility of the majors going in to produce oil in Mexico, particularly in the Gulf of Mexico, in the deep waters where Pemex has not been able to actually get to the oil that exists there. Now, the political prospects for this legislation are really good. Enrique Peña Nieto is not the first president of Mexico to try to introduce legislation like this. Going back to Carlos Salinas, Vicente Fox, and most recently Felipe Calderón in 2008, tried to shake up the Mexican oil and gas sector but were unsuccessful. They were pushed back by national sentiment, very nationalistic national sentiment, very traditional national sentiment that ties oil directly to Mexican sovereignty. And the opposition parties and certain members of the governing party refused to contemplate it. But right now, we have a situation in the Mexican Congress where the governing party, the PRI party again, has enough votes alongside the center-right party, the PAN, to actually push through these constitutional changes with a two-thirds majority in both chambers of Congress. That means that we will see a new situation. There won't be concessions in Mexico, but there will be the possibility for these profit-sharing deals. In fact, in strictly legal terms, there's a possibility for production-sharing contracts to come through. And that's something that's very, very exciting. Because what we're looking at right now is basically turning the big super tanker that is Pemex and Mexican oil production around. Production has been declining steadily since 2004 in Mexico, from a high point of 3.4 million barrels a day to around 2.55 million barrels a day today. The national oil company loses money every year. It's in fact highly profitable, but the state taxes it far too much. And so it doesn't have enough money to invest in oil and gas exploration to come up with new reserves and new production. But what we're looking at right now is the possibility of private firms going in, investing in E&P in Mexico, and beginning to boost oil production, to boost national reserves. And this will have a big spillover effect into the rest of the Mexican economy, just as we've seen in the United States, and it's been mentioned many times here today about the huge economic impact. That's really been seen in Mexico as the example of how to do things. Mexicans look northwards and they see what's happened in the shale revolution. They see what's happened with tight oil. They see the way that the United States system works, and they say, we'd like to have some of that. They don't want the American system, but they want some of the good bits about it. And so what they really want now is they want to have the benefits in terms of lower fuel costs. They want to have the benefits in terms of a much more dynamic E&P sector. They want to have the benefits in terms of developing technologies and innovation in the country, which will impact not only on the energy sector, but on the economy in general.
So how would you characterize how the Mexican economy has been doing in the past few years, and what sort of change, perhaps even a step change, might we see if this goes forward?
Yeah, the Mexican economy, I mean, for the last decade has underperformed. In the last 2 quarters or the first 2 quarters of this year, it's had actually very, very disappointing growth after all these announcements that came out in the international media. Thomas Friedman came out and talked about how, Mexico was going to be, the next big thing. It was Mexico's moment, according to The Economist. The Financial Times talked about the Aztec tiger. And then, of course, it all kind of, disappointed. We had very, very low growth in the first quarter and actually contracted a little bit in the second quarter. I expect that the economy is going to pick up in the second half of this year, and 2014 is going to be a very good year. But the point is, in the long-term perspective, over the last decade, Mexico has managed to achieve growth rates of around 2% a year. And that's simply not good enough. It's not good enough for the United States. It's certainly not good enough for a developing nation. And that's a real problem. Mexicans still suffer from very, very high levels of poverty. Around 50%, well, 45.5% of the population live in conditions of poverty, and around 11 million people live in extreme poverty. That's around $2 a day, according to Mexican standards. That's something which is unacceptable. You need to have job creation. So what this energy reform, along with a lot of the other reforms that are taking place in Mexico right now, it's really been a stellar year. And if there was something I would say that the United States should look at in Mexico, it's the legislative process right now. The Mexicans have come up with a way to break gridlock in Congress. I live in Washington, and I constantly say, look south, look south. There, people talk to each other. They actually have a negotiating mechanism that works. It's called the Pacto por México, the Pact for Mexico, where the big parties get together, they sit down, they hash out their differences, and they come up with a common legislative agenda. It's extraordinary. And because of that, they've already passed 4 major structural reforms in the first 9 months of the administration. They're about to pass energy reform. They're going to pass a fiscal reform. This will completely turn things around. In terms of the impact on the economy that just the energy reform alone is going to have, we're looking at an extra 0.5% GDP growth per year. We're looking at an extra 100,000 jobs per year. We're looking at the potential for having much lower fuel costs. Mexico actually uses the same gas price as the United States, but it suffers because there isn't the infrastructure in place to bring in enough energy or enough gas from the United States into Mexico. That's being resolved at the moment by building infrastructure, but Mexico should be developing its own shale gas reserves and its resources to supply its economy with the energy that it needs. And that will benefit Mexican competitiveness. And my one last thing that I'll say here, Mexican competitiveness is US competitiveness. Think about what's happened in the extraordinary relationship between Mexico and the United States over the last 20 years. They used to trade things with each other. It's a great video from the 1940s which talks about how Mexico and the United States used to trade so much. They still trade, but what do more than anything else? They build things together. So when Mexico reduces its production costs and becomes more competitive, the United States becomes more competitive. We came up with this great figure last year at the Wilson Center. When the United States imports goods from Mexico, around 40% of the value of those goods originated in the United States. When the United States imports goods from China, 4% of the value of those goods originated in the United States. That means that if you buy Mexican goods, you're helping American jobs. And the more you lower the costs of building things in Mexico, the more you help the US economy.
Yeah, I was going to take you a little further in that and ask about the prospects for greater North American energy integration. We've clearly seen tremendous benefits to both the United States and Canada from US-Canadian partnerships in energy development. But Mexico is not just a US story, it's a Canadian story as well. Canadian companies, Canadian technology, it's all part of the resource mix. So do you think that a significant step forward in Mexico would actually have implications for the whole continent?
Absolutely, and I think there's a number of dimensions to this. One is that you really do not have integrated energy markets across the 3 countries of North America. The United States and Canada are highly integrated. Mexico and the United States are not. So a lot of that depends upon infrastructure projects that I've already talked a little bit about, but we could also talk about electricity transmission, for example. We need to invest heavily in getting more electrons across the border from Mexico to the United States and from the United States to Mexico, in particular from Texas into Mexico. That would be a very, very big advantage in terms of getting cheaper electricity into the Mexican market. Back in the 2000s, something existed called the North American Energy Working Group. It was a great idea, and that group of experts got together and they produced reports and they talked about the prospects and the real potential for a North American energy market, and that died a death. And that's a great shame, I have to say. We need to have something else, a trilateral effort between the 3 countries of North America to come back and to talk about what energy markets look like, what the realities of energy production are, and where we should be in 20, 50 years' time.
Yeah, and that's a great lost opportunity because the U.S. Congress, not just the House, but the House and Senate together, have actually several times passed legislation urging the administration to work on strategic integration of the entire North American energy market. And I think that with these exciting developments in Mexico, plus what the Canadians have been doing well all along, this really is something that gives North America an opportunity to become, once again, the world's clearly dominant economy. But I'd like to switch from the theoretical discussion, the macro discussion, to practical business. And we have 2 great practical businessmen here. We have Ken Hersh of NGP Partners. He's the CEO. And for the past 25, 30 years, Ken has been investing in very large projects. And we also have Lane Britton of Highland Capital Management, but also Falcon Energy. Falcon E&P, where Lane invests in smaller projects, what he considers small, 35 million and under. He does lots and lots of those. So actually, Lane is quite a big guy himself. I'll start with you, Ken. What should we be thinking about in terms of energy regulation?
Well, let me first put in a plug for the private sector in energy. In the last 7 years, United States natural gas demand has gone from 55 BCF a day to about 70 BCF a day. Market share in terms of electric generation for coal has gone from 50% to the mid-30s. There's been vast new areas of reserves opened up. On the oil side, we reversed the decline in oil from 5 million barrels a day of production, pushing 7.5 million barrels a day. of production, those numbers are staggering turnarounds in a time period where everybody thought the U.S. was in terminal decline. It's amazing, and it's actually pretty amazing to think what we could have done if people actually liked us and wanted us around. The amount of ingenuity that happened out of necessity in the private sector, despite some pretty volatile regulatory cycles in the last 25 years that I've been investing, has really been stunning. And if I were to boil it all down to a concept, I would say that the regulatory cycle clearly lags the industry cycle, and because of the inefficiency in the regulatory cycle, they end up putting out yesterday's fire. Mm-hmm. And by that time, the fire's not only out, the forest is already regrowing, and the industry has moved on. And so that concept makes it quite difficult, I think, for the two to coexist. The second thing and I'm not an anti-regulation guy, I think that it's important the industry likes regulation because people that cut corners, bad actors, penalize the people who are doing it right. So it's an important role for regulation to handle kind of the problem of the commons and to create the guardrails. But so many times the regulatory cycle gets hijacked. If we want to have a conversation about shutting down oil and gas production in New Mexico, then let's have the conversation about whether or not we should shut down oil and gas production in New Mexico. Let's not ask the Fish and Wildlife to list the prairie sage lizard as an endangered species so that the industry effectively can't function because it has to look out for an animal that doesn't really populate that area. If we want to have a conversation about the lesser prairie chicken, let's have a conversation about the lesser prairie chicken. Don't use it as a way to hijack the oil and gas. And it happens on both sides of the aisle. And so you end up with these polarizing viewpoints. And the industry sits back, takes a deep breath, and says they'll deal with that punch, absorb it, and move on. So what I find my underlying message would be how stunningly able the industry has been to perform against the odds of very sometimes nonsensical outcomes from very well-meaning regulations. Today, there's a perfect example that today, 5 and 6 years ago, it was very important to say that we should try to leapfrog the biofuel. Everyone saw what was happening with corn-based ethanol. If we create incentives, if we really create the umbrella to say that by year 2012 and 2013, the refining industry has to blend a certain amount of cellulosic ethanol into its gasoline blend and not corn ethanol. That's a noble gesture. But today, the refining industry is paying a penalty for not using a fuel that doesn't exist, which is just, and we're feeling it all in the gas pump. So that's just an example that today is a result of well-meaning legislation 5 and 6 and 7 years ago. So I just think that where we are today is that there are these small little proxies for these agendas that get magnified through individual regulation, and the industry has to deal with it. And despite that, however, the industry seems to be doing okay for itself.
Well, Lane, you remind me of one of my favorite theories about Washington, which is what I call the Alpha Centauri effect. Alpha Centauri is a star 4.3 light years away. So anything that happens in Alpha Centauri, we don't find out about until at least one presidential administration later. And the interesting thing about energy regulation is the extent to which regulation lags the problem tremendously. And the story in particular of hydraulic fracturing, the shale revolution, and so forth is technology moving very, very quickly. The scale of a resource moving very, very quickly. And far more quickly than Washington was really able to analyze the situation, to understand what was going on. We had a political agenda in the energy world that was premised on the idea of natural gas being scarce. Really, I give the Bush administration great kudos for doing a lot to make natural gas more available from public lands during the Bush 43 administration. They got an extra TCF out of federal lands. But in the year 2008, natural gas was $10 on average for the year. It was $14 at one point. Even during a recession, it was $14. So everyone assumed that gas prices were going higher and higher. and yet within a matter of years, gas prices collapsed to a $2.50 range, largely because of the success of this new technology. Lane, what's on your mind? I mean, what would be helpful to the industry, helpful to gas production, aside from simply refraining to badmouth it so much?
Sure. So I come from it a little bit different angle. We invest in projects with the little guys, small oil, the thousands of independent operators spread across the United States that I really see as the backbone of the oil and gas business. They're going to get up every day. They're going to go do what they do because it's the only thing they know how to do, which is go and drill wells. So I think there are a couple of things that would help, and a couple of things that, especially down at that level, people see nonsensical. Public lands access, when it takes, when you have to fill out a 49-part form, it takes 100 days just to get somebody to accept the form after many iterations, and then it takes another 100, 150 days for them to tell you, yes, you can go drill there. You can't run a business that way. You can't, you have to get a rig, you have to get the people out there, you have to raise the capital. You can't just sit around and wait for the government to hopefully permit something. So it's, in essence, as the ex-governor of North Dakota said, there's one well drilled.
Yeah, that was really amazing. Governor Schaefer said there was one hydraulically fractured well on federal land in North Dakota, or maybe just one well on federal land.
I think, yeah, one Bakken well out there. And so when you think about the huge boom, it's because nobody can, when you're deploying the kind of capital you are, and the returns are very sensitive to time, you can't wait. So that just pushes that off to the side. In the end, does it destroy the private industry? No. I mean, we just find other places to drill. But it does rob, it's sort of a double swat at the United States, at the people, because in the end, it's our minerals. It's everybody in this room's minerals sitting under that land. It belongs to the government. So we're not getting the royalties. And then and if we did produce that, it would lower costs at the pump if it's oil, it lower natural gas costs. So the government's working against us all. It's become a huge bureaucratic mess. It's too many people involved, and everybody's afraid of making a decision. I don't know how you fix it. I'm certainly not a Washington guy, but it's something that, from an economic and an investor standpoint, seems like something that has to be fixed, and it's in all our interests, not just the greedy oil and gas explorers, everyone interested in fixing it.
Well, one thing we could do is simply let states which have proven records managing their own territories manage state and private land and public land alike. If you had the state of Wyoming running both public land and the private and state lands, I think you'd see much faster permitting there. And I think that would be a relatively simple change to make, at least legislatively. But Ambassador Gray was talking about natural gas and transportation, and we talked a bit about the supply side for natural gas. What else could we do to develop internal uses for the natural gas that we have?
So we have this huge wealth of gas that we didn't know about 10 years ago. We're sitting here, we have it, we've been able to push the break-even price down. 7-8 years ago, $7-8 is what we needed to drill a lot of these wells. We've gotten better at drilling, we've gotten better at fracking, we've made the whole thing a lot more efficient. There's a lot of gas available at $5, and we're not far from that now. So we have all of this gas available. Transportation, as Ambassador Gray said, we have to attack that. I don't know why the government is hesitant to do it. They've given incentives for solar and wind. There's nothing that helps the U.S. economy, the oil price actually push. If we use more natural gas to move vehicles, whether it's heavy trucks or light vehicles around, it'll push our use of oil down. It'll benefit the economy. And it, just from an import-export standpoint, we can use it in this country instead of just having it sit in the ground.
Sure, finally, export refined product and get foreign exchange earnings, high value added export, and not again have to borrow from our Chinese friends. So Ken,
I would say that it's one thing to say the government ought to do X. I would just like for everybody to appreciate that the power of the markets is pretty phenomenal. And we've only had about 3 years or 4 years of the realization that we have a multi-100-year supply of natural gas, that we've driven the cost, as Lane said, down into the $3 range, whereas oil's gone up, where this competitive edge exists, and look what's happening. The industry is responding, the demand markets are responding. And so I would say, I don't even want the government to give me special dispensation. Just let's make sure it's level playing fields and let the markets work. And frankly, the energy markets are so big and so powerful that any government that decides that they're going to fiat the energy markets, they end up creating such unintended consequences they get run over. And they end up with higher cost energy, which is one of the most regressive things you can do. I think that if natural gas stays at the price level it is and oil stays at the price level it is, you're going to see fleets turn, you're going to see long-haul trucking turn, and because it justifies the capital expenditure. I don't like this feeling that the industry has to go hat in hand to Washington every time because it's late. And by the time Washington debates it, it looks like you're getting special dispensation. Let the market work. Don't distort the market because it's a powerful thing. And we will end up with the most efficient, lowest cost production done here. And we will use our great endowment of lower cost energy to revive a manufacturing base that will rival what it looked like 50 and 75 years ago if we let it. And it may be in transportation. It may not be in transportation. If we end up having so much of a cost to retrofit our transportation fleets, then we may be much more of an exporter of petrochemicals than having cars. So I think that so much of the problem feels like that it's Washington's role to do something. And I think when Washington does math, 2 + 2 = 5. And that's a hard thing to rely upon. And I try not to put ourselves deploying capital in reliance upon Washington doing the right thing by us.
Yeah.
If I could just...
Sure, I was about to go back to you.
Just to say, just quickly, my complaint is not that the government should do anything special for gas or any other. They ought to stop discriminating against.
Exactly.
And ought to stop raising barriers to entry and ought to stop supporting an existing monopoly. They just ought to get out of the way and level the playing field.
Yeah, I was actually going to build on that point myself because I've actually been tremendously impressed at the speed with which long-distance trucking is moving into LNG as fuel, the speed with which rail is looking at LNG, shipping. Obviously, it feels glacially slow, but in the energy world, it takes a long time to make these enormous investments in capital and infrastructure. Fleet vehicles are another area where we're seeing fuel turnover. But I think I also agree with Ambassador Gray that in terms of light-duty vehicles, passenger vehicles, you really have an unfortunate and arbitrary lock-in to gasoline and an inability to diversify away from other fuels just because of regulations that are premised on gasoline being the only vehicle fuel or gasoline substitutes. But I want to talk about exports a little bit. With this tremendous new supply of natural gas, the idea that we have effectively unlimited supplies of gas at a $5 level, the fact, or at least the proposal, I wonder, Ken, what you think of this idea that's certainly current, that our gas supply is really dependent on the rig count. So we just decide how much we want to use, we let prices stabilize, but ultimately it's a matter of how many rigs we need to produce, how many BCF day we need. Should the United States focus on energy exports or domestic consumption?
Well, you probably know where I stand. I mean, I think that if it's a competitive product, if it's more economic for us to export the raw material because the price differentials internationally are such that we export the raw material, then that's what we should do. If it makes more sense to use the raw material and make fertilizers or petrochemicals or plastics, and we export the higher value product, because that's the value, that's where the value chain works. And I think that's what's going to happen. I'm excited that we have people actually building export terminals. We now got the 4th one permitted yesterday, or the first phase
export
of it,
permit,
the export permits. But I want to remind people that we have 10 import terminals that are now being turned around. So the world changed on a dime. And the amount of capital that was invested to import natural gas was all wasted. So I think the industry is very dynamic, and it's something that having more markets is better than having fewer markets. But at the end of the day, the real value-added product will find the right home, and anybody who tries to jam it down is going to distort a market. Imagine if we said we can't export corn. Imagine if we said we can't export cotton. Imagine if we said we can't export petrochemicals because it's too precious. Where would Dow and DuPont be then if they want us to make sure that we have an artificial barrier to keep natural gas prices artificially low. Clearly, if we had said that about corn, because we want to feed our population, heaven forbid we should export our corn and somehow import sweetened products. And so that, that would really be crazy for the American farmer. But you could make the same analogous argument. So I think at the end of the day, logic bears out. Everybody just takes a deep breath, and then it finally meanders through the system, and it seems to get to the right answer.
Well, I want to go to Duncan next, then to Lane, and then maybe wrap up with Professor Miners and Ambassador Gray. Duncan, you had a thought. You were waving over there.
I think it's fascinating the debate that exists in this country about whether you can export hydrocarbons. I think it's a totally bizarre concept.
Yes.
It's like, why are they different to anything else? Isn't it just energy? Isn't it just another product? But anyway, the fact that you've got a market waiting just south of the border that desperately needs huge quantities of natural gas, and yes, the infrastructure is being built there to get it there, but you also think about what the potential is for exporting U.S. gas to Mexico for the petrochemicals industry, exporting U.S. gas to Mexico for liquefaction, and then export to Asia, where it'll take you a much shorter period of time to get the permits for an LNG plant. And that's something that the Mexicans are beginning to wake up to, and they're thinking seriously about this, and they're building the infrastructure, finally, sort of a gas pipeline infrastructure in the country to be able to accept big imports of gas. And add on to that, of course, the fact they're building up their own reserves. You've got a really, really interesting situation. But it feeds back into the part of the question that we talked about earlier on. We're probably past the point where we should be talking about nations. We should be talking about the North American energy region. And we should be talking about this from the point of view of using North America as a regional energy and manufacturing goods export platform, because that's really where you get the big advantages. And so rather than thinking in terms of which country are we in, which economic region are we in? It's clear to any of us who have been to a place like El Paso, Ciudad Juarez, that that's a defined economic region that goes across the border. Tijuana, San Diego, obviously. Laredo, Nuevo Laredo. But it's not just those cities, the border towns, but the broader economic regions around them. And you see it on the northern border as well with Canada. And you see it within the United States. It's not national. It's really about economic regions these days.
Well, as someone with a family farm situated between Petrolia and Oil Springs, Ontario, where, with all due respect to Governor Corbett, we were producing oil and gas in 1858, a year before Titusville, I think that the North American energy concept is really tremendously important. But I think I want to bring up with Lane something we were discussing the other day, which is the role of exports and the paradoxical reality that if you want to maximize domestic production and rationalize the domestic energy economy, you need access to the global markets to rebalance your internal domestic markets for light sweet crude, for various crude slates, and so forth. Do you want to build on that, Lane?
I mean, and I agree with Ken. I mean, the government would get out of the way and let the market act. We would, and I think one interesting fact is everybody's wringing their hands about LNG exports, but we're building a 2.5 BCF a day pipe to send gas to Mexico, and no one seems to care. And I think it's great they don't care, that the politicians don't, and everybody's wringing their hand, but that's twice as big as the biggest export facility that's been approved. So it's interesting how some things get politicized and some things don't. The other thing we are coming on is we're producing more light sweet crude than we have in a long time. Refineries 10, 15 years ago decided everything was going to be a heavy crude slate, so they made their refineries where they could burn the Mexican crude or Venezuelan crude or the more sour crude coming from the Middle East, and all of a sudden we have this new resurgence in light sweet crude. So we're starting to push out, as Governor Corbett would say, push out the exports of light sweet crude, and we're going to have to do something with it. We cannot export that right now. That is insane. We should be able to export and balance the market. The EPA also won't let us retrofit our refineries to be able to efficiently use this oil efficiently in the refineries. So you're going to have producers who are driving the production and trying to increase oil production and in the end lower the overall cost for the American consumer, be penalized because they're going to get a discount on their barrel of oil in Texas, in the Mid-Con region, whereas if you were able to put that on a boat and send it somewhere else, it would trade on an international price a lot higher.
In other words, you just can't produce full blast in the United States if you have to worry about a supply glut lowering the prices.
Yeah, that's right. You can, but your price is going to be pushed down. Less wells are economic. And so you're not going to be as incentivized to produce in the United States. And this is the only way to fix this is get a relief valve and let the light sweet crude go where it wants to in the world market. We're not self-sufficient. We're not going to be self-sufficient anytime soon, so it's not going to ruin the American crude price or change our life.
Well, we've got 30 seconds left. I want to go to Ambassador Gray and just ask about the geopolitical implications of shipping gas to Europe, shipping gas to our allies in Asia, especially Japan, providing more energy to Latin America, being less reliant on the Saudis. What's not to like? And would the Europeans really appreciate an alternative supply source?
Oh, the Europeans would appreciate. They would. They have actually initiated an antitrust investigation. They call it competition there, of Gazprom for monopolizing gas in Europe, and it's already resulted in huge price drops as they have to respond to discovery. So it would so change things in Europe that I think it would be as transformative as anything I've seen. We're now talking about a free trade agreement with Europe. It's heavy going because there's so many of the French don't want this and that. But that would give us the right to export gas without going through any permitting process. In terms of the Middle East, you know, what more needs to be said? If one could stabilize, lower prices, make them more predictable, I think that'd be more. There's a new study that's out. I'm not sure I really understand all of it, but it posits that for the last decade, we incurred $1 trillion in debt as a result of volatile oil prices. And I think if one stabilizes that, gets them, and by adding competition, diversity, et cetera, then I think not only would the Middle East calm down, we could calm down, Russia would get back in its place, and the world would be better for it.
Well, we're going from an era of energy scarcity to energy abundance. Unfortunately, having used our abundant time, we're now in a time scarcity situation. We're actually in something of a deficit with regard to our Q&A period. I'd like to get some questions from the audience, especially a question for Professor Miner. I didn't get a chance to address him toward the end. It's a little difficult for me to see who has a hand up because of the lighting, but if you do hold your hand up, I will be able to spot you, and I'm sure the wonderful folks from the Bush Institute can spot you before I do. It looks, yes, we have motion here. Yes, sir.
Thank you, and thank you all very much for your presentations. 25 years ago, when we talked about development in the developing world, particularly energy development, there was a very strong argument between the balance of the environmental concerns for those developing nations versus the wealth that we'd be creating in those nations. And at the time, economists were arguing that poverty was that wealth would offset the poverty. That was, in fact, a greater risk to those countries than was the environmental threat. The slogan was poverty kills, and I haven't heard that argument for a long time. I don't know whether there's been some adequate studies that looked into it in the energy area or others, and I wanted to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
So the question stated briefly is, are we looking at wealthier societies providing better outcomes for their citizens? Well, Professor Miner, I was going to go to you. Do you want to take that on?
Sure, and as Duncan has talked about, if you have a country that has a large, very poor population, their best hope is a little bit of economic growth. They're not concerned about these fine levels of pollutants that we can worry about in wealthy nations. The biggest problem in much of the world is the millions of people who die every year from the wood they burn inside the houses they live in because they don't have access to clean electricity. So it not only stimulates economic growth, but it stimulates the quality of life when people do have access to the kind of energy that we enjoy. And as the panelists have talked about, this comes about because of markets competing, firms competing in markets. If governments control energy, you end up with Venezuela. They got plenty of energy, but their economy is a wreck.
Okay, we have time for one or two more questions. Again, I can't see hands up, but maybe if we had more energetic motion. Oh, there's a gentleman there in the center, yes.
This is perhaps a question for Mr. Gray. I'm interested in the political process, or maybe lack thereof, of pushing forward some of the agendas. I think we're all in broad agreement today.
I'm not sure I understand the question. The framers designed the system not to work, you know.
They did a good job.
They did a good job. I mean, if Congress isn't acting, you know, there's an old saying in Washington, you know, the worst thing that ever happened was the development of air conditioning, which allowed them to stick around all summer long. So I'm not terribly worried. I'm maybe a little older than most people. I'm not terribly worried about the fact that Congress is dysfunctional. But I do think that the court system is going to have to pick up on monitoring what the sort of executive overreach that we're seeing because the White House thinks that since Congress is not going to pass, you know, stupid bills, that therefore they can do stupid things unilaterally. The courts are going to have to clean that up. I think the courts are prepared now. You've seen some more aggressive behavior in recent months. One thing that I'm not sure this is answering your question, but one thing which has gotten no publicity whatsoever, and most lawyers don't know about it, let alone non-lawyers, but it was a paper that your senator, your junior senator, put out that lists the sort of dozen cases in the last 18 months where the Supreme Court has thrown out an executive assertion of authority by a vote of 9-0. This is not a vote of 5-4 on partisan lines. This is a vote of 9-0. Now, why hasn't that gotten any publicity? Well, the mainstream media doesn't want you to know it. But I think the courts are doing their job and picking up the slack on where maybe Congress is in a little era of dysfunction. But I believe it'll all work out. I have great faith in our system, and I'm not terrified of.
Well, I'd also like to invoke another panel member who isn't here. Congressman Brady is still in Washington trying to figure out if he needs to be there for a Syria vote or not. But one thing I've noticed over the past few years is watching, you know, I've really worked in and around Capitol Hill for 25 years now, and I've seen the energy IQ of Congress increase substantially over that time, in large part due to the real immediate impact we're seeing from the shale revolution in places like Pennsylvania and North Dakota. Everybody really wants a piece of that action. And this is occurring on a bipartisan basis with Senator Ron Wyden, who's very, very excited by the prospects for clean energy development that can be had with natural gas. He's becoming more congenial to gas exports. We have a new crop of Democratic senators like Senator Heitkamp, who are very, very pro-energy production in their states. So I do think that things are turning for the better. I think that more senators, more congressmen, more Democrats and more Republicans do appreciate the central opportunity that energy development offers in America. And while the industry is moving forward based on technology, innovation, the resource potential in global markets, I do think that Washington is getting to the point, too, where they appreciate what energy means. And with that, our time scarcity has come to a time crunch. We're done. Thanks, Jim.